The interior temperature read 72 degrees while 40 below zero raged outside, and Thomas Whitmore hadn't added wood to his fire in 6 hours. What other prospectors called Whitmore's Woodpile had just saved his life in the worst cold snap the Colorado Rockies had seen in 20 years. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals an even more unbelievable survival innovation from the frontier. The cabin was supposed to keep them alive. That was the only job it had. But on the morning of December 18, 1862, Thomas Whitmore woke to find his partner, Robert Chen, dead in his bedroll, 3 feet from a fire that had burned all night. The fire was still going. Thomas could see the flames, feel the heat on his face when he leaned close. But 6 feet back from the hearth, the air was cold enough to freeze water. Robert had gone to sleep complaining about the chill. He never woke up. Thomas knelt beside the body, not quite believing what he was seeing. Robert's face was peaceful, but his skin had the waxy quality of frozen meat. His bedroll was covered with frost. The man had died of cold, less than 10 feet from a roaring fire, inside a cabin they had built to protect them from exactly this. Thomas stood and looked around the cabin with new eyes. It was standard construction, the kind thousands of men built across the Colorado Territory every year. 4 walls of notched logs, a door made of split planks, 1 small window covered with oiled paper, and a simple stone fireplace. They had built it in 5 days that October. It had seemed adequate then. Now Thomas saw it differently. He saw the gaps between logs where chinking had dried and fallen out. He saw the oiled paper window pulsing with each gust of wind. He saw frost forming on the interior walls despite the fire. He saw the door with visible daylight around 3 sides of the frame. The cabin was a sieve. Every bit of heat the fire produced escaped through 100 gaps and cracks. On a night when the temperature dropped to 20 below zero, the fire simply could not produce heat fast enough to overcome the losses. Thomas had known the cabin was drafty. Every prospector's cabin was drafty. Men accepted it as frontier life. You built fast, you built simple, and you fed the fire constantly. If you woke up cold, you added more wood. Except Robert had added wood. Thomas had heard him get up twice during the night to feed the flames. The man had done everything right, and he had still frozen to death. Thomas walked to the fireplace and held his hands near the flames. The heat was intense on his palms, but 3 paces back, the warmth vanished completely. The fire was creating heat, but the cabin was not holding it. He examined the door frame. The gap around the edges was wide enough to slide a knife blade through. Cold air poured in continuously, replacing any warmth the fire generated. The window had torn, oiled paper flapping with each wind gust. The walls showed gaps everywhere between logs, some wide enough to see daylight through. The cabin was killing them, and Thomas had not realized it until too late. He spent that morning wrapping Robert's body in canvas and carrying it outside. The ground was frozen solid. Thomas placed the body near a rock outcropping and piled stones over it. He would bury Robert properly in spring. When he came back inside, Thomas sat by the fire for a long time. Other men would have mourned and moved on. Thomas became fixated on a single question that would not leave his mind. Why did cabins fail to hold heat, and was there a better way to build them? Thomas spent 3 days alone in the cabin that had killed his partner. He kept the fire burning constantly, feeding it logs every 2 hours, watching how quickly the heat disappeared into the frigid air. He was conducting an experiment, though he did not think of it in those terms. He was trying to understand failure. On the first day, he mapped every gap in the structure. He found 47 places where light passed through the walls. He found 12 spots where the chinking had fallen out completely. He discovered that the doorframe had warped, creating a gap that ran the entire height on the left side. Cold air poured through these openings with such force that he could feel it on his skin from across the room. On the second day, he attempted repairs. He mixed mud and moss, the traditional chinking material, and packed it into the gaps between logs. The work took hours. By evening, he had sealed most of the visible holes. He went to sleep believing he had solved the problem. He woke on the third morning to find his repairs had failed. The mud had frozen, then cracked, then fallen out in chunks during the night. The gaps were as wide as before. Worse, some of his repairs had actually created new problems by trapping moisture that froze and expanded, pushing logs slightly apart. That morning, Thomas walked to the rock outcropping where Robert's body lay under its cairn of stones. The sky was clear, painfully blue, the kind of perfect winter day that killed men with its beauty. The temperature was perhaps 10 below zero, not extreme by mountain standards, but cold enough to be deadly without proper shelter. Thomas stood there for a long time, looking at the stones that covered his partner. Robert had been 41 years old, a former railroad worker from California who had come to Colorado chasing gold. He had been careful, competent, and experienced. He had survived 2 winters in the mountains before this one. He had done nothing wrong except sleep in a poorly built cabin on a cold night. The randomness of it made Thomas angry, not the grief-stricken anger of loss, but the cold anger of someone who has seen a problem that should not exist. Men were dying in the mountains not because the wilderness was unconquerable, but because they were using inadequate solutions to solvable problems. Thomas had learned carpentry from his father in Pennsylvania. He knew how to notch logs, how to build a door, how to construct a basic frame. But he realized now that knowing how to build something quickly was not the same as knowing how to build it well. Speed had been the priority. Get a roof overhead before winter. Worry about comfort later. Robert had paid for that priority with his life. Thomas walked back to the cabin and began gathering his tools. He would finish out the winter here, but come spring, he would tear this structure down and build something different, something that actually worked. He did not yet know what that would look like, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never build a cabin this way again. Spring came late to the Colorado Rockies in 1863. Snow lingered in shaded valleys through April, but by early May, the high country had thawed enough for Thomas to begin his investigation. He left his claim and traveled to other prospecting sites within a day's ride, looking for abandoned cabins. There were many. The gold rush had brought thousands of men into the mountains. Most left after one winter. Some died. Others simply gave up and went home. Their cabins remained, slowly collapsing back into the forest. Thomas examined 12 abandoned structures in the first week. He brought a notebook and pencil, something most prospectors never carried, and he recorded what he found with the precision of a scientist conducting research. Cabin 1 had a collapsed roof. The logs used for roof beams were too thin, unable to support the weight of heavy snow. Cabin 2 had walls that had separated at the corners. The notches had been cut poorly, and settling had pulled the structure apart. Cabin 3 had burned. Someone had built the fireplace too close to the back wall, and sparks had ignited the dry logs. But the pattern Thomas noticed most was the same problem his own cabin had: heat loss through gaps and inadequate sealing. Every structure showed the same failures: chinking that had dried and crumbled, doors that had warped and no longer fit their frames, windows that were simply holes covered with whatever material was available. He began asking questions of prospectors he encountered. How cold did their cabins get at night? How much firewood did they burn in a day? Had anyone died from cold? The answers were remarkably consistent. Most men burned between 12 and 15 logs per night, just to maintain marginally survivable temperatures. Many woke every 2 hours to feed their fires. Several admitted they had nearly frozen despite having wood and fire available. 2 told him about partners who had died, circumstances identical to Robert's death. Thomas visited the settlement of Fairplay, a supply town that served the surrounding mining camps. He spent time watching a stonemason named Giuseppe Rossi working on a new mercantile building. Rossi was from Italy, trained in old-world techniques that seemed almost magical to frontier observers. Thomas watched how Rossi mixed mortar, how he selected stones for fit, how he built walls that were solid and permanent. The stone walls were thick, sometimes 18 inches across. They took weeks to build, but when finished, they were structures that would last generations. One afternoon, Thomas asked Rossi why stone buildings stayed warmer than wood cabins. Rossi looked at him like the answer was obvious. "Mass," he said in his heavy accent. "Stone holds heat. Your log cabin, it has no mass. Heat goes right through. Stone absorbs heat during day, releases it at night. Is simple." Thomas thought about this for a long time. Stone held heat because of its mass and density. Wood did not, especially when stacked horizontally with gaps between each log. But wood was the only practical building material in the mountains. Stone was too heavy to transport, too difficult to work without specialized tools. That night, sitting in a boarding house in Fairplay, Thomas had the idea that would change everything. What if you could build with wood the way Rossi built with stone? Thomas spent 2 weeks in Fairplay, ostensibly buying supplies, but actually studying construction techniques that had nothing to do with mining. He watched carpenters frame buildings. He observed a blacksmith creating iron brackets. He spent hours talking to Giuseppe Rossi about thermal mass, insulation, and moisture management. Rossi explained concepts that frontier builders rarely considered. Heat moved through materials at different rates. Dense materials absorbed and stored heat. Air pockets provided insulation. Moisture was the enemy of both warmth and structural integrity. These were principles Italian masons had understood for centuries, but they had not migrated to American frontier construction, where speed mattered more than quality. Thomas filled his notebook with sketches and calculations. He drew cross-sections of walls, roof designs, door assemblies. He worked out the mathematics of heat retention, calculating how much warmer a cabin could be if it actually held the heat generated by a fire. The idea that formed in his mind was radical. Instead of building walls from long horizontal logs with gaps between them, what if walls were built from short sections of logs, stacked vertically like stones in a wall? Wood rounds, perhaps 16 inches long, placed on end, and mortared together the way Rossi mortared stones. The concept solved multiple problems simultaneously. Short wood sections would be easier to cut and transport than long logs. They could be selected for uniformity, eliminating the taper that made long logs difficult to fit. Most importantly, when mortared together properly, they would create a solid mass with no gaps for heat to escape. Thomas sketched the idea repeatedly, refining it. The wood rounds would be stacked in a running bond pattern, like bricks with mortar between each piece. The mortar would seal gaps and provide thermal mass. The wood itself would provide insulation. The combination would create a wall that was both dense enough to store heat and insulated enough to retain it. He showed his drawings to Rossi one afternoon. The stonemason studied them carefully, then nodded slowly. "This could work," he said. "But the mortar must be right. Too much lime, it cracks. Too little, it does not bind. And you must keep moisture out." Thomas asked what mortar formula would work with wood. Rossi provided ratios: 3 parts sand, 1 part lime, mixed with water to a thick consistency. But he added a crucial detail. With wood, you add sawdust, maybe 1 part sawdust to 4 parts sand. Gives flexibility, adds insulation. Thomas wrote this down carefully. Then he asked the question that mattered most. Will it hold heat? Thomas returned to his claim in late May with his unusual supplies loaded on 2 pack mules. The journey took 3 days. When he arrived, he immediately began tearing down the cabin that had killed Robert. He saved what he could: the door hinges, some usable planks, the stones from the fireplace. Everything else he dismantled methodically, stacking the logs in a pile. They would become firewood, nothing more. He would not reuse a single log in his new structure. Other prospectors working nearby claims noticed the demolition. A man named Henry Caldwell rode over on the second day to ask what Thomas was doing. "Building a new cabin," Thomas said, pulling another log free from the old structure. "What was wrong with this one?" "It killed my partner." Caldwell looked uncomfortable. Everyone had heard about Robert's death. "That was bad luck, Thomas. Cold night. Could happen to anyone." Thomas stopped working and looked at Caldwell directly. "It was not luck. It was bad construction. This cabin could not hold heat. I am building one that can." Caldwell glanced at the supplies Thomas had brought back. The lime and sand were obvious, unusual for a mining camp. "You planning to build a stone cabin?" "No, wood, but built like stone." Caldwell waited for elaboration. When none came, he shook his head. "Well, good luck with that." He rode off, clearly thinking Thomas had lost his mind. By early June, Thomas had cleared the old cabin site completely and begun laying out his new foundation. He dug a trench 2 feet deep around the perimeter of where his new cabin would stand, 10 feet by 12 feet interior dimension. He filled the trench with rocks, creating a stable, level base that would prevent settling. This alone took a week. Most prospectors would have started building on bare ground and been finished with an entire cabin in that time. But Thomas was not building for speed. Word spread through the scattered prospecting community that Whitmore was doing something strange at his claim. Men began stopping by to watch, the way people slow down to observe an accident. Thomas began cutting logs into rounds. He selected standing dead pine, trees that had died but not yet begun to rot. The wood was dry, stable, and abundant. He felled trees, cut them into 16-inch sections, and split some of the larger rounds to create uniform pieces approximately 8 inches in diameter. The work was brutal. Each tree yielded perhaps 20 usable rounds. Thomas calculated he would need approximately 500 rounds for his cabin walls. That meant felling and processing 25 trees, then cutting and splitting hundreds of pieces to exact specifications. A prospector named Jack Morrison stopped by in mid-June and watched Thomas working for half an hour. Finally, he called out, "You know, you can just use whole logs, right? What you are doing is making firewood." "I am making building material," Thomas replied, not stopping his work. "That is firewood," Morrison insisted. "You are going to stack firewood into a cabin? How is that going to work?" "You will see," Morrison laughed. "Whitmore's Woodpile. That is what we are calling it. You are building the most expensive firewood pile in Colorado." The name stuck. Within a week, every prospector within 5 miles was referring to Thomas's project as Whitmore's Woodpile. Some men offered to buy his rounds for actual firewood. Others made jokes about how at least he would not freeze next winter since he was stacking his fuel supply into walls. Thomas ignored all of it. He kept cutting, kept splitting, kept stacking rounds to dry in the sun. His pile of prepared wood grew slowly, and with it grew the conviction that he was right and everyone else was wrong. By late June, Thomas had enough wood rounds prepared to begin actual construction. But first, he needed to solve a problem that most prospectors never considered: moisture management. Wood and mortar both suffered from moisture. Wet wood rotted, mortar absorbed water, froze, and cracked. The foundation of Thomas's cabin needed to prevent ground moisture from wicking up into the walls, while also providing a stable, level surface for construction. He had already dug his trench and filled it with rocks. Now he took the next step that made other prospectors shake their heads in disbelief. He began laying flat stones across the top of his rock-filled trench, creating a level surface that extended 8 inches above ground level. Thomas spent 2 full weeks gathering and placing these stones. He walked the creek beds, selecting flat pieces of granite and sandstone. He hauled them back to his site, sometimes carrying stones that weighed 40 pounds. He fitted them together like a puzzle, using small rocks and gravel to fill gaps. Henry Caldwell stopped by during the stonework and watched Thomas positioning rocks with obsessive precision. "You know you are building a cabin, not a courthouse," Caldwell said. "I am building something that will last," Thomas replied. "Most of us will not be here in 5 years. Gold runs out, we move on, and why build like you are staying forever?" Thomas set another stone carefully. "Because I might stay. And if I do not, whoever comes next will have a cabin that works." The foundation work revealed something important about Thomas's character. He was not fast, he was not efficient by frontier standards, but he was thorough to the point of obsession. Every stone was tested for stability. Every gap was filled. The final platform was leveled to within half an inch across its entire surface. When the stone foundation was complete, Thomas built a wooden sill plate on top of it. He used thick planks hewn from pine logs, treated with a mixture of pine pitch and linseed oil he had purchased in Fairplay. The treatment made the wood water-resistant and provided a barrier between the stone and the wood rounds that would form his walls. He drilled holes through the sill plate and into the stone foundation, then drove wooden pins through to lock everything together. The sill plate could not shift or move. It was permanently anchored to the stone base. By mid-July, Thomas was ready to begin the walls. He had spent 6 weeks on foundation work. A traditional cabin would have been completed and occupied. Thomas had not yet placed a single wall element. But his foundation was perfect. It was level, stable, moisture-proof, and strong enough to support whatever he built on top of it. Every hour spent on foundation work was an investment in the building's longevity. Giuseppe Rossi had explained why this mattered. Ground moisture moved upward through capillary action. If wood sat directly on soil, it absorbed moisture and began to rot within months. But if wood sat on stone, with an air gap between stone and ground, moisture could not reach the wood. The cabin would stay dry. Thomas mixed his first batch of mortar on July 15, 1863. He combined sand, lime, sawdust, and water in the ratios Rossi had specified. He stirred it until the consistency was like thick mud, able to hold its shape but still workable. He placed his first wood round on the sill plate, set it in a bed of mortar, and checked it for level. Then he placed a second round next to it, mortared the joint between them, and checked again. The wall had begun. The technique Thomas developed for building his cordwood walls was simple in concept but demanding in execution. Each wood round was placed vertically, like a bottle standing on end. Mortar was applied to the bottom, the sides, and between each piece. The rounds were stacked in a running bond pattern, offset like bricks so that vertical joints never aligned. The walls were thick. Thomas built them 12 inches deep, using rounds that were 8 inches in diameter, with 2 inches of mortar on each end. This created a wall cross-section with wood on the interior face, mortar in the middle, and wood on the exterior face. The 2-inch mortar layer in the center provided thermal mass. The wood on both sides provided insulation. The construction method was slow. Thomas could place perhaps 30 rounds in a day, working from sunrise to sunset. Each piece had to be checked for level. Each mortar joint had to be properly filled and shaped. He used a trowel to create smooth joints on both interior and exterior faces, scraping away excess mortar and pressing it firmly into gaps. Within a week, the first course of rounds was complete, circling the entire foundation. The wall stood 16 inches high. Thomas's cabin would need walls 7 feet tall, which meant approximately 5 courses of rounds. At his current pace, the walls alone would take 2 months. Jack Morrison rode by in late July and found Thomas laying rounds in the second course. Morrison dismounted and walked around the emerging structure, examining it closely. "I will give you this, Whitmore. It looks solid, but it also looks insane." Thomas paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. The summer heat made the mortar dry faster, which meant working quickly once a batch was mixed. "Why insane?" "Because you are mortaring firewood into walls. What happens when that wood shrinks? or swells, or just decides to rot because you have trapped it in lime mortar? These were legitimate questions. Thomas had thought about them extensively. The rounds are dry before I place them. They will not shrink further. They will not swell because the mortar prevents moisture absorption, and they will not rot because they stay dry. Morrison was unconvinced. And when winter comes, when snow piles against these walls, that mortar will crack. Perhaps, Thomas admitted, but I do not think so. The sawdust in the mortar gives it flexibility. It should accommodate the freeze-thaw cycle. Should? That is a lot of work based on should. Thomas resumed placing rounds. I watched my partner freeze to death in a cabin built the normal way. I am done with normal. Morrison mounted his horse but paused before leaving. The boys in camp are taking bets on whether Whitmore's woodpile makes it through one winter. Most money says it collapses by February. Thomas said nothing. He simply placed another round, checked it for level, and moved on to the next. The work became meditative. Mix mortar, place round, check level, scrape excess, repeat. Thomas fell into a rhythm that required little conscious thought. His hands knew what to do. His mind wandered to other problems. How to build the door frame, what to do about the roof, whether his mortar formula was truly optimal. He made small adjustments as he learned. He discovered that slightly wetter mortar bonded better but took longer to cure. He found that rougher wood surfaces, where bark had been stripped, created better adhesion than smooth surfaces. He learned to identify rounds with internal cracks or rot and reject them before placement. By early August, the walls stood 4 feet high. The structure was beginning to look like a cabin rather than an experiment. The round wood faces created an unusual texture, nothing like the horizontal lines of traditional log construction. Thomas thought it looked right. As the walls rose higher, Thomas encountered his first serious problem. The mortar he had been using worked adequately, but it was not perfect. After curing for several weeks, some joints showed fine cracks. Not structural failures, but hairline separations that concerned him. Thomas understood that those cracks, however small, represented potential heat loss. Every gap in the wall was a path for warm air to escape. If his cabin developed hundreds of tiny cracks throughout the mortar joints, it would defeat the entire purpose of his design. He stopped construction and spent 3 days experimenting with mortar formulas. He mixed small batches with different ratios of sand, lime, and sawdust. He tested each batch by making sample joints with wood rounds, letting them cure, then examining them for cracks. The original formula Rossi had provided was 3 parts sand, 1 part lime, 1 part sawdust. Thus, Thomas created variations, more sawdust for flexibility, more lime for strength, different types of sand for varying particle sizes. He made 18 different test batches, carefully documenting each formula in his notebook. The breakthrough came when Thomas tried adding clay to the mixture. He dug clay from the creek bank, dried it, crushed it into powder, and added it to his mortar at a ratio of 1 part clay to 10 parts of the original mixture. The clay filled microscopic voids between sand particles, creating a denser, more complete seal. He tested this modified mortar and found it superior in every way. It bonded more strongly to wood. It cured without cracking. It was slightly more flexible, better able to accommodate minor movements in the wood, and critically, it was more water-resistant. Thomas spent 2 more days testing the clay-enhanced mortar under various conditions. He froze samples overnight, then thawed them in sunlight. He soaked samples in water for hours, then dried them. He tried to break samples by prying wood rounds apart. The modified mortar passed every test. Satisfied, Thomas returned to construction with his improved formula. The difference was immediately apparent. The mortar applied more smoothly, filled joints more completely, and cured to a harder, more durable finish. Thomas felt confident that these walls would be genuinely weatherproof. But the experimentation had cost him time. It was mid-August and his walls were only halfway to their target height. Other prospectors had been watching his progress, or lack thereof. The consensus in the mining camps was that Whitmore had lost his mind and would likely freeze next winter while living in an unfinished cabin. Thomas ignored the talk. He mixed mortar, placed rounds, and built his walls with the patience of someone who understood that quality could not be rushed. By late August, the walls reached 6 feet. Thomas was tall enough that he needed to stand on a platform to place the upper courses. He built a simple scaffold from scrap lumber, a raised platform that let him work comfortably at wall height. The physical labor was constant and exhausting, hauling sand and lime, mixing mortar, lifting rounds into place, shaping joints. Thomas's hands were perpetually covered in lime dust, his fingers cracked and raw from the caustic mortar. But he never stopped. Every round placed was one round closer to a cabin that would actually protect him. He began thinking about the final courses, the top of the wall, where he would need to support roof beams. Traditional log cabins used the top logs to carry roof weight. Thomas's cordwood walls would need a different solution. He planned to set thick wooden beams horizontally across the top course, creating a continuous sill that would support roof rafters. The beams would be mortared in place, becoming part of the wall structure itself. By the first week of September, Thomas placed the final rounds. By early September, Thomas's walls reached their full height of 7 feet. The final course of wood rounds was complete, and he had set thick pine beams horizontally across the top, mortared into place. The beams created a continuous sill that would support his roof structure, while also capping the walls and preventing water from entering the mortar joints from above. The completed walls revealed the genius of Thomas's design. From the exterior, the cabin looked unusual, but not radical. The round ends of the wood created a textured surface, almost like stone cobbles. But the real innovation was invisible, hidden within the wall structure itself. Thomas had created what modern engineers would call a thermal mass wall with integrated insulation. The mortar core provided density and mass, absorbing heat slowly during the day. The wood on both interior and exterior faces provided insulation, slowing the transfer of heat through the wall. The combination meant the walls would warm gradually when the cabin was heated, then release that stored heat slowly over many hours. This was fundamentally different from traditional log cabin walls. Horizontal logs had minimal thermal mass and poor insulation value because gaps between logs allowed air movement. Heat passed through them rapidly. Thomas's walls had no gaps, no air movement, and significantly more mass per square foot of wall surface. He had also solved the moisture problem that plagued traditional cabins. The mortar sealed every joint completely. Water could not penetrate from outside. More importantly, interior moisture from cooking, breathing, and living could not condense within the walls because there were no air gaps for warm, moist air to enter and contact cold surfaces. Thomas tested his walls by throwing a bucket of water against the exterior. The water ran down the surface but did not penetrate. He examined the interior face and found it completely dry. The walls were genuinely waterproof. Henry Caldwell stopped by on a cool September evening and found Thomas sitting inside his wall enclosure, though there was no roof yet. "You actually finished the walls," Caldwell said, genuinely surprised. "I did not think you would get this far before snow." "The walls are complete," Thomas confirmed. "Now the roof." Caldwell walked around the structure, running his hand over the interior surface. The mortared joints were smooth. The wood rounds fitted so precisely that the wall felt almost like a single solid piece. "I admit this is impressive, but the real test comes in winter. These walls might look solid, but will they hold heat?" Thomas had done the calculations in his notebook. Based on the thermal properties of wood and mortar, his walls should retain heat approximately 4 times longer than traditional log walls. A fire that burned for 2 hours should keep the cabin warm for 8 hours or more. But calculations were theory. Caldwell was right. The real test would come when temperatures dropped below zero and staying warm became a matter of survival. "They will hold heat," Thomas said with quiet confidence. "I built them to do exactly that." Caldwell nodded slowly. "Well, I hope you are right, because if you are wrong, you have wasted 4 months building an elaborate death trap." After Caldwell left, Thomas remained inside his wall enclosure. He had no roof, no door, no window, but he had walls that were solid, weatherproof, and designed to retain heat. The foundation of his survival was complete. Now he needed to finish the rest before winter arrived. He had perhaps 6 weeks. Traditional cabin roofs were simple structures, poles laid across the walls, covered with bark or split planks, topped with sod. They leaked during rain, shed snow poorly, and provided minimal insulation. Thomas intended to build something better. He had studied roof design during his time in Fairplay, paying particular attention to how snow accumulated and how different roof pitches affected snow load. He had learned that steep roofs shed snow quickly, while shallow roofs held snow, using it as insulation. Thomas decided to build a roof that would hold snow deliberately. His design called for a shallow pitch, just enough to prevent water pooling, but not enough to shed snow. The snow would accumulate across the entire roof surface, creating a thick, insulating blanket that would keep the cabin warm even in the coldest weather. This was heretical thinking. Every prospector Thomas knew built steep roofs specifically to shed snow. The conventional wisdom was that snow on a roof was dangerous, adding weight that could cause collapse. Thomas disagreed. Snow was free insulation, and if the structure was strong enough to support it, snow accumulation was an advantage. He began by laying thick rafters across his wall beams, spaced 18 inches apart. The rafters were pine logs, 8 inches in diameter, far heavier than necessary by traditional standards, but Thomas was building for snow load. He calculated his roof might accumulate 2 feet of snow, weighing perhaps 40 pounds per square foot. His rafters could support twice that load safely. Across the rafters, he laid split planks, each one fitted tightly against the next. He pegged the planks to the rafters using wooden pins driven through pre-drilled holes. The planks created a solid deck, essentially a wooden floor, suspended above his cabin. Over the planks, Thomas laid birch bark in overlapping layers, like shingles. Birch bark was naturally waterproof and flexible. It would prevent water from penetrating to the wood below. He secured the bark with wooden pegs and covered the seams with pine pitch. The next layer was burlap canvas soaked in linseed oil. Thomas had purchased the canvas in Fairplay specifically for this purpose. The oiled canvas created a flexible waterproof membrane over the entire roof. He overlapped the canvas sections by 6 inches and sealed the seams with more pine pitch. Over the canvas, Thomas spread a mixture of clay and straw, working it into a layer 3 inches thick. The clay straw layer would dry hard, creating a semi-rigid surface that would protect the canvas from damage and provide additional waterproofing. Finally, over the clay, Thomas laid sod. He cut squares of prairie grass with roots intact, carried them to his roof, and fitted them together like tiles. The grass would continue growing, its roots binding the soil together, creating a living roof that was waterproof, insulated, and virtually indestructible. The entire roof assembly was 12 inches thick and extraordinarily heavy. But Thomas's wall structure supported the weight easily. The cordwood walls were essentially solid masonry, capable of bearing enormous loads without deflection. Jack Morrison visited while Thomas was laying sod on the roof. He stared up at the structure in disbelief. "You put dirt on your roof, dirt with grass growing in it." "It is a sod roof," Thomas said, common in many places. "Common for dugouts and hovels, not for cabins. That roof must weigh 1,000 pounds. "Closer to 1,500, Thomas corrected. "But the walls can support it." Morrison shook his head. "When snow piles on top of that, you will have a ton of weight on this structure. It will collapse." Thomas climbed down from the roof and looked at Morrison directly. "It will not collapse. I built it to hold the weight, and when winter comes, That snow will keep me warm." With the roof complete, Thomas turned his attention to the cabin's most vulnerable point, the window. Every cabin needed light and ventilation, but windows were inherently weak. They broke easily, lost heat rapidly, and created condensation problems that led to rot and mold. Thomas had watched ice form on the interior of oiled paper windows in his previous cabin. He had felt cold air pouring through gaps around window frames. He had seen how a single broken window could make a cabin uninhabitable. He was determined to solve all these problems. His window design was radical. Instead of a single large opening, Thomas created a small window, only 12 inches square. He positioned it high on the south wall, 6 feet above the interior floor. The small size minimized heat loss. The high position allowed light to enter while preventing cold air from pooling at floor level. The frame was built from thick planks, mortared directly into the cordwood wall during construction. The frame was not attached to the wall. It was part of the wall, integrated into the structure itself. This eliminated gaps around the frame where air could leak. For the window covering, Thomas created a triple-layer system. The innermost layer was oiled canvas stretched across a wooden frame. The canvas was translucent, allowing diffused light to enter while blocking wind. The middle layer was a wooden shutter, made from thick planks hinged on the interior. The shutter could be opened during the day for maximum light or closed at night for insulation. The outer layer was the innovation Thomas was most proud of. He created a fixed outer frame with multiple small panes instead of one large opening. He divided the 12-inch square into 4 smaller sections, each 3 inches by 6 inches. For each section, he used a piece of actual glass. Glass was expensive and difficult to transport, but Thomas had purchased 4 small panes in Fairplay, carrying them wrapped in cloth and packed in sawdust. The small panes were far less likely to break than a single, large pane. If one broke, the others would still function. He set each glass pane in a wooden frame with pine pitch as sealant, creating a weatherproof seal. The 4 panes together created a window that allowed clear light to enter while being far more durable than traditional single-pane windows. The spacing between layers created dead air gaps, which provided insulation. The interior canvas layer prevented condensation from forming on the glass by keeping interior moisture away from the cold outer surface. The middle shutter provided additional insulation when closed. Thomas tested the window system on a cool September night. With the shutter closed, he lit a candle inside and checked for drafts. He felt no air movement. He placed his hand near the window and felt no cold. The triple-layer design was working exactly as intended. Henry Caldwell examined the window and admitted grudging respect. "That is clever. 3 layers, each serving a different purpose. But why make it so small?" "Because every square inch of window loses heat," Thomas explained. "A small window loses less heat than a large one. This provides enough light without sacrificing warmth." "Most men want big windows. Most men freeze," Caldwell laughed. "You have an answer for everything, do you not?" Thomas smiled slightly. "I have an answer for cold. That is all I needed." The window was complete. Thomas now had walls, a roof, and a window. He needed only a door, and his cabin would be enclosed and ready for winter. The door was Thomas's final major challenge. Like the window, the door was a potential weak point, where heat could escape and cold could enter. But unlike the window, the door needed to open regularly, which meant it could not be permanently sealed. It had to be both functional and secure. Thomas built his door with the same obsessive attention to detail he had applied to everything else. He started with thick planks hewn from a single pine log, ensuring all the wood came from the same tree and would expand and contract at the same rate. Each plank was 2 inches thick, far heavier than standard door construction. He fitted the planks together using tongue and groove joints, interlocking them so tightly that light could not pass between them. He reinforced the assembled door with diagonal braces on the interior face, creating an X pattern that prevented warping. The entire door weighed nearly 70 pounds, but it was rigid and solid. The door frame was mortared into the cordwood wall, integrated into the structure the same way the window frame was. Thomas had left an opening during wall construction, building the frame directly into the stonework. The frame could not shift or separate from the walls. For hinges, Thomas used iron hardware he had purchased in Fairplay. The hinges were massive, designed for barn doors, far stronger than necessary for a cabin door. He mortised them into both the door and the frame, creating connections that could not be torn free without destroying the wood itself. The door opened inward, which was unconventional. Most cabin doors opened outward to prevent snow from blocking them shut. But Thomas wanted the door to open inward so snow accumulation would actually seal it more tightly. He also recessed the door 6 inches into the wall, creating a protected alcove that blocked wind and prevented drafts. For a locking mechanism, Thomas created a simple but effective wooden bar that dropped into iron brackets mounted on the interior wall. When engaged, the bar connected the door directly to the wall structure. The door could not be forced open without breaking the bar or destroying the wall. He added weather stripping around the door frame using strips of leather soaked in linseed oil. The leather created a flexible seal that compressed when the door closed, blocking any gaps. The result was a door that sealed as tightly as the walls themselves. With the door installed, Thomas's cabin was completely enclosed for the first time. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The interior was dark, lit only by the small window. The space was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, but it felt solid and protected. Thomas built a raised sleeping platform along one wall, keeping himself off the cold floor. He constructed a simple table and a bench. He built shelves for supplies, mounted high on the walls. Every piece of furniture was functional and sturdy, built to last years. The fireplace was his final task. He built it in the corner using flat stones mortared together. The firebox was small, designed for efficiency rather than size. The chimney was narrow, rising through the roof with a stone cap to keep out rain. He included a smoke shelf inside the chimney, a horizontal ledge that prevented downdrafts and reflected heat back into the room. On October 1, 1863, Thomas lit his first fire in the new cabin. He used small pieces of kindling, building a modest fire that produced steady heat without excessive flame. He sat on his bench and watched the fire burn, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin. The temperature inside rose quickly. Within an hour, the cabin was comfortably warm despite cool evening air outside. Thomas checked for drafts and found none. He examined the walls and ceiling for smoke leaks and saw none. The cabin was sealed, weatherproof, and functional. He had built something that actually worked. By early October, Thomas's cabin was complete. Walls, roof, door, window, fireplace, and interior furnishings were all finished. The structure stood solid and weatherproof, ready for winter. But Thomas had no proof that his design would actually work as intended. Other prospectors remained skeptical. Henry Caldwell stopped by on October 5th to examine the finished cabin. He walked around the exterior, studying the cordwood walls and the thick sod roof. He opened and closed the heavy door, testing its weight and fit. He peered through the small window at the interior. "It is well built," Caldwell admitted. "I will give you that. But well built does not mean warm. You have spent 5 months on this. I hope it was worth it." "We will know soon enough," Thomas replied. That night, temperatures dropped to near freezing. Thomas lit a small fire in his fireplace, using perhaps a third of the wood he would have burned in his old cabin. He sat at his table and monitored the interior temperature using a thermometer he had purchased in Fairplay. The cabin warmed quickly. Within an hour, the interior temperature reached 65 degrees. Thomas let the fire burn down to coals, then stopped adding wood entirely. He wanted to see how long the cabin would retain heat without active heating. 2 hours later, the interior temperature had dropped only 3 degrees. The walls were working exactly as he had calculated. They had absorbed heat from the fire and were now releasing it slowly back into the room. Thomas went to sleep with confidence, letting the fire die completely. He woke the next morning to find the interior temperature at 58 degrees. Outside, the temperature was 32 degrees, right at freezing. His cabin had maintained a 26-degree temperature difference overnight with no fire at all. The thermal mass of the walls had stored enough heat to keep the space comfortable for 8 hours. Thomas was satisfied, but not surprised. The physics had predicted this result, but knowing something should work and proving it actually worked were different things. He now had proof. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas refined his heating strategy. He discovered that a small fire burned for 2 hours in the evening provided enough heat to keep the cabin comfortable through the entire night. He learned that opening the window shutter during sunny days allowed solar heat to warm the interior, reducing his firewood consumption further. By late October, Thomas was using approximately 4 logs per day to heat his cabin. Other prospectors were burning 12 to 15 logs daily and still complained about cold nights. Word began to spread that Whitmore's woodpile was actually working. Jack Morrison visited on October 28th and asked to see the interior. Thomas invited him inside. Morrison stood in the cabin, feeling the warmth, examining the walls, touching the smooth mortar joints. "How much wood did you burn today?" Morrison asked. 3 logs so far. I will burn 1 more tonight." Morrison was silent for a moment. "I burned that much before noon, and my cabin is still cold." "Because your cabin does not hold heat," Thomas explained. "Mine does. The walls store warmth and release it slowly. I do not fight the cold. I prevent it." Morrison left without saying more, but Thomas could see him thinking. The demonstration was more powerful than any explanation. The first test was complete. Thomas's cabin worked. But the real validation would come when winter arrived in full force. Winter came to the Colorado Rockies with unusual ferocity in December of 1863. The first major storm hit on December 7th, dropping 2 feet of snow in 24 hours. Temperatures plummeted to 10 below zero. Prospectors huddled in their cabins, burning wood desperately to stay warm. Thomas watched the snow accumulate on his roof with satisfaction. The shallow pitch he had designed captured the snow perfectly, building a thick blanket that covered the entire surface. The sod roof beneath the snow remained intact, supporting the weight easily. The snow layer added insulation, making the cabin even warmer. Inside, Thomas maintained comfortable temperatures with minimal fire. The combination of thick walls, insulated roof, and snow cover created a structure that was remarkably efficient. He burned perhaps 5 logs on the coldest days, half what other prospectors consumed. But the real test came later that month. On December 20th, a high-pressure system settled over the region, bringing clear skies and brutal cold. With no cloud cover to trap heat, temperatures dropped catastrophically. By the evening of December 21st, thermometers in the mining camps read 30 below zero. By midnight, it was 35 below. By dawn on December 22nd, it was 40 below zero. This was killing cold. At 40 below, exposed skin froze in minutes. Breathing hurt. Metal became brittle and snapped. Water, thrown into the air, froze before hitting the ground. This was the kind of cold that ended lives and closed mining camps. Thomas woke on that morning and checked his interior thermometer. The cabin was 62 degrees. He had let his fire die during the night, and the temperature had dropped 8 degrees. But 62 degrees was perfectly comfortable. Outside was 40 below. Inside was 62 above. His cabin was maintaining a 102-degree temperature difference with no active heating. He rebuilt his fire, a small blaze that brought the interior temperature back to 68 degrees within an hour. Then he dressed in his warmest clothing and went outside to check on his neighbors. The devastation was immediate and obvious. Smoke poured from every cabin chimney as men burned wood frantically. Thomas visited Henry Caldwell's claim first and found Caldwell awake, exhausted, feeding logs into his fireplace continuously. "How long have you been awake?" Thomas asked. "All night," Caldwell replied, his voice hoarse. "If I let the fire die, I will freeze. I have burned 20 logs since sunset, and I am still cold." Thomas looked around Caldwell's cabin. Frost covered the interior walls. Ice had formed around the window. The doorframe showed gaps with visible daylight. Every flaw in the construction was magnified by the extreme cold. "Come stay in my cabin," Thomas offered. "You can sleep. I have heat to spare." Caldwell looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "Your cabin is warm? In this cold?" 68 degrees inside right now. I burned 5 logs yesterday. I will burn maybe 6 today." Caldwell did not believe him, but he was too exhausted to argue. He gathered a few belongings and followed Thomas back to his claim. When they entered Thomas's cabin, the warmth hit Caldwell like a physical force. He stood just inside the door, staring at the thermometer on the wall. 68 degrees, Caldwell said quietly. "It is 40 below outside and 68 inside your cabin. The walls hold heat," Thomas explained. "I told you they would." Caldwell sat on Thomas's bench and put his head in his hands. He was too tired to speak. Thomas gave him a blanket and let him sleep. Caldwell slept for 6 hours straight, the first real rest he had gotten in days. The extreme cold continued for 3 days. Temperatures remained below 30 degrees throughout that period, with nighttime lows reaching 40 below zero on 2 consecutive nights. The entire prospecting community was in crisis. Men burned through their firewood supplies at catastrophic rates. Some abandoned their claims and fled to Fairplay or Denver, unable to survive the conditions. Thomas kept his cabin warm with minimal effort. He burned 6 to 8 logs per day, maintaining interior temperatures between 65 and 70 degrees. His firewood supply remained adequate. He was never in danger of running out. On the second night of the freeze, December 23rd, Morrison appeared at Thomas's door near midnight. Morrison was shaking violently, his face pale, his movements uncoordinated. He was showing signs of hypothermia. Thomas pulled him inside and sat him near the fireplace. He wrapped Morrison in blankets and gave him warm water to drink. Morrison's shaking gradually subsided as his core temperature rose. After half an hour, he could speak coherently. "My cabin is not survivable," Morrison said. "I burned everything I could. Furniture, extra planks, everything. The fire kept going out. I could not stay warm." "You can stay here," Thomas said. "There is room." Morrison looked around the small cabin. With Caldwell already asleep on the floor and Morrison now inside, the space was crowded, but it was warm. The walls radiated gentle heat. The air was comfortable. This cabin was keeping 3 men alive, while other cabins failed to protect even one. "How is this possible?" Morrison asked. "We are in the same storm, the same cold. Why does your cabin work when mine does not?" Thomas explained the principles he had built into his design: thermal mass, insulation, elimination of air gaps, weatherproofing, snow retention for additional insulation, every element working together to create a system that retained heat instead of hemorrhaging it. Morrison listened carefully. When Thomas finished, Morrison said quietly, "I called this Whitmore's Woodpile. I made jokes. I bet money that it would fail. I was wrong about everything." "You were not alone," Thomas replied. "Everyone thought I was wasting my time. But you were right. You built something that actually works, and you probably saved my life tonight." The 3 men spent that night in Thomas's cabin. Outside, the temperature was 38 below zero. Inside, with a small fire burning, the temperature was a comfortable 67 degrees. The cabin held 3 adult men, their combined body heat, and the heat from a modest fire, and it stayed perfectly warm. By morning, word had spread through the remaining prospectors. Whitmore's cabin had sheltered 3 men through the worst cold anyone had experienced. Men who had mocked Thomas's design now asked to see it. Men who had built traditional cabins began calculating what it would take to rebuild using Thomas's methods. The validation was complete. The impossible cabin that everyone had dismissed had proven itself under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Thomas had been right. Everyone else had been wrong. And the difference between being right and being wrong was the difference between survival and death. The cold snap broke on December 25th. Temperatures rose to a relatively mild 10 below zero, which felt tropical after 3 days of extreme cold. Men emerged from their cabins to assess the damage and check on neighbors. 2 prospectors had died during the freeze. One was found in his cabin, frozen in his bedroll. Another had attempted to walk to Fairplay and collapsed on the trail. Several others had abandoned their claims entirely, their cabins uninhabitable, their firewood exhausted. Thomas's claim became a gathering point for survivors. Men came to see the cabin that had worked when everything else failed. They examined the cordwood walls, running their hands over the mortared joints. They studied the thick sod roof with its snow cover. They opened and closed the heavy door, noting how perfectly it sealed. They looked through the small triple-layer window. Henry Caldwell, recovered from his exhaustion, became an unexpected advocate for Thomas's design. He told everyone who would listen how Thomas's cabin had maintained comfortable temperatures while his own cabin had nearly killed him. He described sleeping peacefully in warmth while outside was 40 below zero. "I thought he was insane," Caldwell admitted to a group of prospectors gathered at Thomas's claim. 5 months to build a cabin, using mortar and wood rounds like stone masonry? It seemed like madness. But it works. It actually works better than anything I have ever seen. Jack Morrison was equally vocal. He had returned to his own cabin to salvage what he could, but he was planning to rebuild using Thomas's methods. "I will not spend another winter in a cabin that tries to kill me," Morrison said. "If I stay in these mountains, I will build like Whitmore built." Thomas answered questions patiently. How thick should the walls be? 12 inches minimum. What mortar formula? 3 parts sand, 1 part lime, 1 part sawdust, 1/10 part clay. How long should the wood rounds be? 16 inches for 12-inch walls. How much does it cost? More than a traditional cabin in materials, but less in firewood over time. Several prospectors wanted Thomas to build cabins for them. They offered to pay him to provide labor, to do whatever necessary. Thomas declined. He was not a builder for hire, he was a prospector. But he freely shared his knowledge with anyone willing to learn. A prospector named William Hart asked the question others were thinking. "Why did you figure this out when the rest of us did not? What made you see what we all missed?" Thomas thought about this for a moment. "I watched my partner die," he said quietly. "I could not accept that it was inevitable, so I looked for a better way. Most men accept frontier hardship as unavoidable. I did not accept it. I solved it." That answer resonated with the men listening. Frontier life was brutal. Men died from cold, from accidents, from disease, from violence. Most people accepted these deaths as the cost of wilderness living. Thomas had rejected that acceptance and engineered a solution. By early January of 1864, 3 prospectors had begun building cordwood cabins based on Thomas's design. They worked slowly, following his instructions carefully. Thomas visited their sites occasionally, offering advice and corrections. The technique was spreading, but the majority of prospectors did not rebuild. Some left the mountains entirely, unwilling to face another winter. Others repaired their traditional cabins and hoped for milder weather. A few were simply too stubborn to admit that a better method existed. Thomas understood. Change was difficult. Admitting you had been wrong was harder. Building a cabin the correct way required time and effort that most men would not invest. His technique would spread slowly, adopted by those who had nearly died and refused to risk it again. That was acceptable. Thomas had not built his cabin to change the world. He had built it to survive. Spring arrived in April of 1864, melting the snow and revealing a transformed prospecting community. Of the 47 prospectors who had worked claims in the area before winter, only 23 remained. Some had died. Most had simply left, unwilling to face another season in the mountains. Of those who remained, 7 were building new cabins using Thomas's cordwood method. The construction sites were scattered across the region, each one a slow, careful process that drew observers and questions. The technique was spreading, but not through enthusiasm. It was spreading through fear. The men building cordwood cabins were survivors who had nearly frozen. They had experienced the terror of watching their fires fail to keep them warm. They had felt ice forming on interior walls, despite burning wood desperately. They had faced death and survived by luck, or by abandoning their claims. They would not risk traditional construction again. William Hart completed his cordwood cabin in June. It was smaller than Thomas's, only 8 feet by 10 feet, but it followed the same principles. Thick, mortared walls, sod roof, small window, heavy door. Hart invited Thomas to inspect it, nervous about whether he had done it correctly. Thomas examined the structure carefully. The mortar joints were adequate, though not as smooth as his own. The wood rounds were less uniform, showing Hart's willingness to accept pieces Thomas would have rejected. The roof pitch was slightly steeper, which would shed more snow, but overall the cabin was sound. "It will keep you warm," Thomas said. "You built it well enough." Hart exhaled with relief. "I was worried I had missed something. This took me 3 months. If it failed, I would have wasted the entire summer." "It will not fail," Thomas assured him. "You followed the principles. That is what matters." By autumn, all 7 cordwood cabins were complete. The prospecting community now had 8 structures built using the new method. They stood out visibly from traditional log cabins, their rounded wood faces creating a distinctive texture. Other prospectors began calling them Whitmore cabins, or simply the mortared type. Thomas noticed something interesting that fall. The men who had built cordwood cabins were more confident about winter. They stockpiled less firewood. They made fewer trips to Fairplay for supplies. They showed none of the anxiety that permeated the traditional cabin dwellers as cold weather approached. When snow fell in November, Thomas watched his neighbors. The cordwood cabins performed exactly as expected. Smoke rose from their chimneys in thin wisps, indicating small fires. The traditional log cabins poured smoke from large fires that burned constantly. Henry Caldwell stopped by Thomas's claim in early December. "I am building a new cabin next spring," he announced. "Cordwood method. I will not spend another winter like last year." "That is wise," Thomas said. "I should have built this way from the start. I wasted 2 years in a cabin that barely worked, but I did not know better. Now I do." That was the pattern Thomas observed. Men learned slowly, often only after suffering, but once they learned, they changed. The technique was spreading not through persuasion, but through demonstration. The cordwood cabins worked. The traditional cabins struggled. The difference was obvious to anyone paying attention. By the end of 1864, the phrase, "built like Whitmore," had entered the local vocabulary. It meant solid construction, careful workmanship, and reliable performance. It was a compliment that Thomas never sought but could not avoid. The innovation he had created to save his own life was slowly becoming the standard, not because he promoted it, but because it solved a problem that killed men every winter. Thomas Whitmore left the Colorado Rockies in the spring of 1867. The gold on his claim had played out, and he had saved enough money to start a different life. He sold his claim to a younger prospector named Daniel Warren, who had specifically sought out Thomas's property because of the cabin. "This is the best-built structure in the territory," Warren said during the sale. "I would rather have this cabin than any other claim in the mountains." Thomas appreciated the sentiment, but felt no particular pride. He had built the cabin to survive, nothing more. That it had become legendary was accidental. He moved to Denver and opened a small carpentry shop. He built furniture, cabinets, and occasionally consulted on building projects. He married in 1869 a widow named Sarah Mitchell, who appreciated his quiet competence. They had 2 children who grew up knowing their father had once been a prospector, but nothing about his wilderness innovations. Thomas never returned to the mountains, but the cabins remained. The cordwood method continued spreading through the prospecting communities of Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming. Men who built using the technique taught others. The knowledge passed from prospector to prospector, claim to claim, region to region. By the 1870s, cordwood construction was common enough that supply stores in frontier towns stocked lime and mortar tools specifically for cabin builders. Carpentry manuals began including sections on cordwood masonry. The method Thomas had improvised from desperation had become an established technique. The cabins themselves proved remarkably durable. Thomas's original structure stood for 43 years before a forest fire finally destroyed it in 1906. Other cordwood cabins built in the 1860s remained occupied into the 1920s and 30s, sheltering multiple generations of miners, trappers, and eventually homesteaders. Modern historians estimate that cordwood construction saved at least 50 lives over the 2 decades following Thomas's innovation. That number includes men who survived extreme cold that would have killed them in traditional cabins, but it also includes indirect deaths prevented. Fewer cases of pneumonia from chronic cold exposure, fewer fires from desperate attempts to stay warm, fewer cases of frostbite and cold-related injuries. Thomas Whitmore died in Denver in March of 1889 at the age of 53. Pneumonia took him quickly, an irony not lost on those who knew his history. The man who had solved the problem of staying warm in extreme cold died from a respiratory infection in a comfortable city home. His obituary in the Denver newspaper made no mention of his cabin-building innovation. It listed him as a carpenter and former prospector, survived by his wife and children. The reporter who wrote the obituary had no idea that the man he was describing had changed frontier construction methods across the entire Rocky Mountain region. But in the mountains, Thomas's legacy continued. Cabins built using his methods still stood, still sheltered people, still demonstrated that proper engineering could overcome brutal conditions. Prospectors and homesteaders who lived in cordwood cabins knew they were warm because someone, decades earlier, had figured out a better way to build. The innovation spread anonymously, attributed to no one, simply accepted as how things were done. That was how most frontier knowledge transferred, slowly, practically, without fanfare or credit. Men learned what worked and taught others. The chain of knowledge extended backward in time to sources no one remembered. Thomas Whitmore became one of those forgotten sources. His name faded, his specific contribution was lost. But the cabins remained, scattered across the Rockies, solid and warm and functional, built not in stone or steel, but in mortared wood rounds that still stood decades after their creator had died. The impossible had become routine. A cabin that could maintain 70 degrees inside while 40 below zero raged outside was no longer remarkable. It was simply how you built if you wanted to survive. And that transformation from impossible to ordinary was Thomas Whitmore's true legacy, preserved not in memory or monuments, but in the walls of cabins that outlasted him by generations.